Okay, I believe we can go.
Okay, thank you, Katarina. Hi, everybody. I hope you're there. At least the 6 of you that are disappeared. Welcome, everybody. We would like to welcome also Lucia Tralli, which will be presenting. The second keynote speech of this encounter of IEM. So Lucia teaches at the American University in Rome, and she's a researcher at the University of Naples. She will be presenting a talk entitled "Studying Fandom Practices: A Gendered Reorientation." So Lucia, go ahead.
Thank you, Philippa, and thank all the organizers for the invitation. I feel honored to be here and excited, and also I would like to congratulate you on a beautiful event organized under this dire circumstances. So hopefully next time we will all be in 3D, enjoying time together. So I will share my screen now, and then I will start. Everything good? Okay. So today, as you can see, I will focus on fun practices, how to study those that we can call gendered fun practices, and how to study them following a sort of reorientation of our disciplines. So in the last years, we have witnessed a growing interest in fun practices and their progressive inclusion and acceptance within mainstream discourses about media. The days of the fan-fanatic equation and fandom as an obscure subcultural practice seem distant. A new era that celebrates fun engagement with media products and rejoices of the monetary value mobilized by such engagement seem more or less accepted as the norm for quite some time now. Nevertheless, some practices and their histories brought on the surface by this increased visibility of fandoms have benefited more public recognition and praise, whether others, usually female-oriented, have not profited from the same open acknowledgement and have been scrutinized and silenced. For example, after decades spent fighting with copyright holders in legal wars, a topic which I'm not touching upon today, it's nowadays more or less accepted that fun engagement, even the kind of engagement that results from the appropriation of protected material, as is the case of fan fiction, memes, GIFs, and fun videos, is actually more profitable than trying to block it and persecuting those that venture into productive fun practices. On the other hand, if a female-based practice, such as fan fiction, has been more and more present in public discourses, also due to some very fortunate and successful literary cases that stemmed from fan fiction authors turned professional authors, the stigma surrounding this form of writing, judged as derivative and emotional without actual merit, and associated with a girly approach to fandom, is indicative of persisting stereotypes that regard fangirls' attitudes towards the media that they love and engage with. If fanboys have seen themselves represented with some degree of benevolence in movies and TV series, I'm thinking of the Big Bang Theory, for example, fangirls and their excessive emotional responses and obsessive attachments to media are still ridiculed and shamed by both mainstream discourses and fandom itself. So it is probably not surprising that the history of some fun practices that intersect multiple issues in terms of legal, social, emotional, and technological aspects and have been practiced predominantly by women and girls have been less explored and told. The aim of my talk today is double. On one side, I would like to explore one of these practices, vitting, and on the other side, I would like to focus on how we can analyze them through a gendered reorientation of tools, theories, and perspectives generated within feminist gender and queer studies. In particular, how we can use perspectives discussed within feminist gender and queer film and media studies to expand fun studies horizons. Vidding is a long-running film practice, predominantly performed by women, that dates back to the 70s, and it has both an analog and a digital history, both an offline and online one. Vidders are fans that create audiovisual remixes using scenes from movies and TV shows that they re-edit, setting them to music, which is usually pop songs, to comment on, criticize, celebrate, or deconstruct a particular media object they are invested in. These remixes are called fun vids, or vids for short. Vidders share and discuss their works and the techniques and skills necessary to create them within different spaces, both offline and online, on platforms that have changed through time. Still, the collective conviviality of the community as a whole has always been very present. As Francesca Coppa says, vidding history is a story of women and technology, of women and visual culture, of women teaching each other not only how to edit, but also how to see the images that surround us. It's a story of relationships. Before starting to delve a bit more in depth into the practice and the reorientation necessary to understand it, I would like to show you some segments of a couple of vids to give you an idea of what I'm talking about and what a fun vid looks like. So the first one is titled Space Girl. It was made in 2011 by a vidder called Charmax. And as you will see, the majority of vidders have pseudonyms or nicknames. They don't use the real names, mostly for privacy reasons, which is the opposite of what we are used to do nowadays on Facebook and other social media. This is a so-called multi-fandom vid, meaning that the sources it appropriates and rework come from a multitude of different sources. In this case, we're talking about more than 50 different sci-fi TV shows and movies that span for almost 4 decades, which have more or less significant female characters. Needless to say, a vid like this one can take weeks of clipping, selecting, and editing to be completed, and it requires a lot of labor. The music and the lyrics in vids are the lenses through which we interpret the images. They complement the editing choices the vidder makes. So when we watch a vid, we should focus on the combination of words, music, and images. Here is Space Girl.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.
Should never venture into space, but I did. She said no Terran girl could trust the Martian race, but I did. A rocket pirate asked me on a voyage to go, and I was so romantic that I couldn't say no. That he was just a silver robot, how was I to know? So I did. She told me never venture out among the asteroids, and yet I did. And she said that the Milky Way was something to avoid, and I did. She said that Venus was too hot and Saturn not much fun. Bug-eyed monsters tended to be just a trifle dumb. She said I'd need a blaster and I'd need a freezer gun, and I did.
Okay, so this was Space Girl. We can see a similar process in another multi-fandom vid, The Greatest, This one was created by Vidar Byronic in 2018, and this is a compilation and celebration again of usually underrepresented characters of color within recent sci-fi shows and movies that the Vidar defined as an artistic act of resistance and celebration because it was created amid fandom political activism against racism during the Trump presidency. And as a note, I am mainly focusing on American or Anglophone fandoms in my research, but of course, communities of fans exist everywhere. So I wanted to show you an excerpt of The Greatest.
Stamina. Oh, running out, I close my eyes, but oh, I got stamina. And I see another mountain to climb, but I got stamina. Oh, I need another lover be mine, 'cause I got stamina. Don't give up, I won't give up. Don't give up, no, no, no. Don't give up, I won't give up. Don't give up, no, no, no. I'm free to be the greatest, I'm alive. I'm free to be the greatest here tonight. The greatest, the greatest, the greatest. I love you. The greatest, the greatest. I love you.
All right, the last one that I wanted to show you just for give you an idea is another vid titled Space Girl. This other Vidar, Orun Kalendula, later the same year in 2018, paid homage to these other two influential vids, creating a new version of Space Girl with only women of color. So the process was as the one by Charmax, but with the same characters that are present in The Greatest.
One, two, three.
My mama told me I should never venture into space, but I did, I did, I did. She said no Terran girl could trust the Martian race, but I did, I did, I did. A rocket pilot asked me on a voyage to go, and I was so romantic that I couldn't say no. That he was just a servo robot, I was right to know. So I did, I did, I did.
Okay, so I'm done with the examples. So these examples do not represent the complexity and variety of this practice. And I have intentionally picked multi-fandom vids because vids made with a unique source tend to be less clear for what we call in Spanish language non-contextual watchers, meaning people that do not know the original work. But these three vids are extremely significant for their capacity to sum up some characteristics of vidding that are important for our discourse. Firstly, vidders have a strong interest in media representation, especially of women and other minoritized groups. And they have the ability to analyze it and criticize it through editing, but also the importance of community, which is somehow celebrated subtextually in these vids and also in the ongoing conversation between these vids and their authors. A vid such as Space Girl, both versions, is not only a celebration of the female characters and protagonists in a beloved genre, but is also a sort of celebration of the community of vidders itself and of the act of vidding and ultimately of being a fan as a collective, transformative, and subversive act. The lyrics of the song chosen by the vidders remind us that these women shouldn't have gone into space, as their mother told them, but they were courageous, adventurous, and reckless, and they did indeed pursue their dream. And in the case of the women of color, this sentiment is even more profound. The video also selected many sequences that feature scenes of female friendship and companionship. These space girls' actions and adventures mirrored the video's own adventure. They have been told not to enjoy media this much. They have been disciplined and silenced, but they continue to collectively engage with the things they love anyway. So how can we tell the stories behind these videos, these practices, and position them within the history of not only fandom practices, but also women audiovisual practices and audience practices? So in one of her recent books, Staying with the Trouble, Donna Haraway used the symbolism of playing string figures, a popular form of storytelling present in almost every culture, to explain the complexity of stories told by intersecting multiple narrations, narrators, and patterns. She says, and I quote her, "String figures are like stories. They propose and enact patterns for participants to inhabit," end of quote. Without the ability to pick on every string, unravel them, and observe their trajectory and the formation of figures that it entails, the capacity to describe and analyze a complex situation eludes us. I found her thinking process with fabulations fascinating and indicative of an intellectual positioning that I aspire one day to bring to my field. She also affirms that it matters what matters we use to think other matters with. This is another quote from the book. It matters what not, and what thoughts think thoughts. So I think that we should start from the ties that ground the foundations of our discourse. And it's starting with a positioning that is rooted in feminist and gender studies. And that is always and has always been a matter of orientation. In this case, I'm borrowing the words of feminist and queer scholar Sarah Ahmed that have deeply influenced my work. An orientation towards the intersection of different strengths that has its origins in the idea and practice of intersectionality. So stemming from Kendall Crenshaw's first articulation of the concept, which focused on the intersection of gender and race, intersectionality has become an indispensable tool to understand, analyze, and think about our contemporary lives. Analyzing women from practices such as bidding implicates necessarily an intersectional and interdisciplinary approach. Alison Harvey defines the intersectional feminist media studies approach as, and I quote her, one that accounts for the complexity of lived experience and address the interconnected and inseparable character of oppression based on gender, race, class, sexuality, age, ability, religion, nationality, and other social certifications. As Audre Lorde would say, we do not live single issues lives, we do not live single issues struggles because we do not live single issues lives. So in order to understand events, practices, products, communities that do not fit single access frameworks, we need better tools. We need to be oriented in different ways at the same time. Moreover, researching from a queer and a feminist perspective in any field means to challenge the boundaries between canons and norms, unruly practices and people, trying to find new and unexpected routes. An orientation that can help us theorize women's non-existence all along media history, and most importantly, can help us fill the void of what once was defined as women's annihilation within the borders of their own history. As the last decades of feminist scholarship have been proving, women weren't absent from history, but instead they were invisible. They were kept invisible, or they were doing work that was conveniently deemed unimportant and undeserving of attention. As Cynthia Enloe would say, we were looking at things with the wrong glasses. In the first chapter of her book, Queer Phenomenology, Sarah Ahmed tells the story of a table. In her case, it's German philosopher Edmund Husserl's writing table, from which he observed the world and wrote his books, starting from his perception of the space around him and the direction towards which he was oriented. He faced what was in front of him, but ignored what was behind him, his background. And here Ahmed proposes a reorientation towards that background, because she says what is behind Husserl's back, what he does not face, might be the back of the house, the feminine space dedicated to the work of care, cleaning, and reproduction. Hamed invites us to follow this unprecedented path of looking at all those things that aren't the writing table or what is in front of the table, invites us to position ourselves in other directions, to reorient ourselves, focusing on the background, starting from our embodied experiences of space and knowledge. Hamed's work, with his emphasis on lived experiences, on emotions, on the speciality of gendered, sexualized, and racialized experiences, on the significance of objects and their nearness and their usage for the building of identities, can help us frame and include such untraditional perspectives into our research of typically feminized domain of knowledge. Such sites of knowledge, cultural production, and meaning making have been neglected for so long. They are overdue to be reinscribed into our understanding of how cultural practices and productions work. In the case of bidding, we are facing a practice that is marginalized within fandom, which is already marginalized in relation to other socially acceptable ways of consuming media. Its practitioners shamed as women too intentionally involved in unimportant things, and its practices of providing unexpected and in some cases subversive readings of popular media culture are frequently belittled. But what about that emergence of fans into the spotlight that I opened this talk with? How do we conceive a world that is both visible and invisible at the same time? I believe that visualizing fandom complexities as a string figure can help its understanding. Fandom could be seen as a series of concentric circles of marginalization, sometimes intersecting, sometimes divergent. Those intersections usually appear when gender or race or other factors come into space. As Rachele Borghi, reinterpreting Bell Hooks' theorizations around the idea of margin, explains, and I quote and translate her, each space has its margins, the margins of the center. If each center configures itself in relation to a periphery, then even inside a central space, we may have marginal spaces. I insist on this idea of margins and multiple spaces because there is a tendency to study fun practices and fandom as a cohesive, organic entity, but that's a misrepresentation that forgets that fandom is in fact plural and impossible to be synthesized into one single story. Studying fun practices means being constantly at the crossroads of many disciplines and theoretical fields. Media studies, fun studies, cultural studies, audience studies, subcultural studies, film and television history, media technology history, media archaeology, internet studies, participatory culture, remix studies, social media studies, and probably I could go on and on. Given the nature of the community and the objects that I'm focusing on, women's studies, gender studies, and queer studies prove to be the interdisciplinary framework most apt to approach this territory, but also containing all these disciplines' perspectives into one reoriented view. So fun studies literature has spent decades justifying their object of study, so frequently deemed too irrelevant and frivolous, as was the case of the discipline from which they stemmed from, which is cultural studies. That was the case for the first phase of fun studies during the 90s, and I'm borrowing here the timeline proposed by Jonathan Gray, Cornel Santos, and Lee Harrington Gray in their fandom Identities and Communities in a Mediated World that was published in 2007. So the first phase was characterized by a search for the legitimacy of fandoms that was found in fans' competence in reading, analyzing, and eventually subverting popular culture in their derivative creations. So the focus was on productive fans and their fan works. At the beginning of the new century, a second phase contested this overtly progressive and political reading of fans and fan works as cultural resistance. It started to focus more on communities and practices as performances and how fans interacted with one another without value judgments. The mid-2000s saluted a third phase of fun studies that tried to understand fun practices in the midst of the media convergence revolution as an everyday practice, that was slowly abandoning its subcultural roots. We are now probably in a fourth phase that Benjamin Hu affirms, focuses more on people, on communities than on texts, and more on specific fun practices and contextual fandoms than on a fandom as a generic, unique entity. Besides the inevitable changes within a discipline that now counts more than 30 years of activity, some preoccupations of the early days seem to stay with fun scholars. In 2018, two large companions of fun studies were published, edited one by Paul Booth and the other by Melissa Clegg and Suzanne Scott. And all editors did agree in an interview that they still have to explain why fans are even an important topic to discuss in academic settings. Amongst the many difficulties in affirming the legitimacy of this kind of research, there is still the necessity to disengage from readings that deemed of value only those practices that were perceived as political or militant and radical compared to mainstream culture. Dealing with fun practices, on the contrary, means observing the coexistence of discourses, approaches, analysis, and contents that may significantly differ from each other. As per my specific interest and positioning, while it is true that some fun scholars do focus on gender and fandom and on some gendered fun practices, mostly fan fiction, I believe that the space for a reorientation of the discipline is still open and to be pursued further. In particular, in regards to vidding, what fascinates me the most and what also gives grounds to the convergence between fan studies and gender and queer studies is that the objects that are at the center of these fields inhabit a specific space where identities, creative practices, politics, resistances, and compliances, pleasures, and desires are all inextricable. In the case of vidders, the writing table, Hamed's writing table, was not intended for them, both in the sense of the audiovisual material they appropriate and watch, and the context of media audiences and fandom. Not as spectators of film and television, as the target audience of audiovisual productions were notoriously always young and middle-aged men. Not in the 70s, when the fandom communities were shaped and managed primarily by men. Not during the progressive visibility of fun practices between the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, when historically male communities obtained more attention. Not during the 2000s era of media convergence, when the traditionally female-oriented transformative fun practices, such as fun videos and fun fiction, were diminished and shamed as and oftentimes legally disputed, and not in a broader sense in the general media, where non-male and non-heterosexual characters representation has been lacking for more than a century. In some ways, we can say that they had to build their own writing table. So it's time to, as Araway said, name and explore some of the knots in this reorientation story, and have picked 4. Editing as a gender technology, the idea of women's cinema as a minor practice, the concept of media pleasure, and labor as a digital reproductive practice. The first 2 knots are connected and pertain to a series of similarities between the history of vidding and female productive fun practices in general, and women's cinema and the history of women and editing. To sum it up, the history of vidding can be divided into at least 3 different phases. So firstly, around the middle of the 70s, the first proto-forms of vids, slideshows, was created within the Star Trek fandom by a vidder named Candy Fong. They consisted of a combination of Polaroids of excerpts from the TV show, Star Trek, projected on a screen during conventions and synced with music from a music cassette player. Here you can see some images from one of those slideshows that was later filmed in beta cassettes. Later, in the first years of the 1980s, VCR technology became widespread in the United States and also elsewhere. Vidders used VCR in a very creative and inventive manner from a prosumer point of view. Here you can see 2 vidders creating one of those vids with VCR machines. They tweaked these machines and to their needs with the spirit of a bricoleur and started to create a more sophisticated kind of slideshow, which they called sung tape or sung video and later sung video. Due to the equipment costs and the complexity of the expertise required, viders were usually grouped into small collectives of people who lived in the same area. These women collectives practiced and created videos together, sharing machines, tapes, and other technical devices, increasing their technical and aesthetic prowess, and more importantly, sharing the passion for their TV shows they watched together and videoed together. This phase of tutoring and mentorship marked the structure of the community and the quality of the strong relationships between bidders that we can still observe on the web today in its digital phase. The third phase in the history of bidding, which is digital bidding, should be divided into two separate stages. So firstly, there was the shift from offline to online fandom activities, which happened in the early 90s. Fans' interactions in real life at conventions and the production of printed material, such as fanzines, were replaced by virtual communications and online archives of fan works. So we had the first blogs, the Usenet groups, the first video sharing platforms that progressively but relentlessly changed the way fans and bidders experienced and practiced fandom. Then between the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, the second stage of the shift to digital bidding was the advent of digital nonlinear editing tools. When digital editing started to be a concrete possibility for bidders with software such as iMovie or Windows Movie Maker that we all have in our computers even today, everyone had potentially the technical devices and tools necessary to create a bid. The ease with which bidders can now practice audiovisual editing allows them to experiment more with styles and techniques and led the practice of bidding to focus more on the narrative construction of bids and the personal and communal readings of the text bidders appropriate. This moment also coincided with social media platforms' diffusion. So LiveJournal and Dreamwidth, YouTube, and later Tumblr became the locations of these communities. The history of bidding and bidders is then a story of women in media profoundly connected with technology and the history of editing. It seemed then intuitive to look for similarities within the literature on women's cinema and that on women's presence in experimental cinema, in particular on found footage, the practice of creating films using appropriated material through re-editing and montage. It is a practice that dates back to the origin of cinema, and more importantly, it has always been substantially practiced by women. So first and foremost, the parallelisms between these stories start with difficulties of retracing them. As Alexandra Dewis states in her Women of Vision, the lack of a canonical women history or her story is also due to a structural issue. These practices were subcultural and countercultural. They were low or no budget. They were independent of regular distribution circuits and formats, and they were secluded and sometimes even closeted. And if it was already a massive issue for women's experimental cinema, it is even more complicated for a subcultural practice such as bidding that happened to be on different media, where the community is scattered in a million websites and platforms, and where the proliferation of digital platforms and tools also means the proliferations of productions, not even mentioning the fact that the majority of bids from the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s even aren't available. Luckily, fans, especially female fans, have taken personally the job of self-preserving and self-archiving their own history in the last years, and that's why I have been able to trace their story. There are several accounts on editing as an inherently feminine practice. The explanations of the large number of women employed as editors since the beginning of cinema history are multiple. Many, of course, start with the connection between the first instruments for cutting and pasting, portions of film, and sewing machines. Besides these accounts that are at risk of providing essentialist perspectives on gendered practices, it is nevertheless undeniable that while struggling to find a place for themselves within the audiovisual industry, women have often chosen the editing room as the room of their own, both as editors for male directors and as authors in their own right. It is not a coincidence that many women in experimental cinema chose montage as their favorite artistic tool. As Monica Dall'Asta and Alessandra Chiarini affirm, I'm quoting them, in the absence of directorial opportunities within the frame of institutional cinema, women may have elected the practice of film footage as a way to build an autonomous space of creativity that allows them to transform limitations into a stylistic peculiarity. The reappropriation and resemantization of media images through editing that is at the center of film footage is also fertile terrain to understand vidding. An infinite number of vids, here you can see a couple, focus on either the subversion of gender stereotypes within media images. That's the case of women's work that deals with the stereotype of the female victim, the exploration of sexual desires, which is the case of Annual Men, that it's a vid about women in drag and lesbian desire, or the analysis of female characters' arcs and their frequent subordination to male protagonists, or on exposing gender-based violence in media, and so on and so on. So these are some topics that are very frequent within fan vids. In fan vids, as in found footage works, editing can be understood as a gendered technology. It is a political and creative device that, profiting from the immediacy of remixing well-known material appropriated from mass media, allows its practitioner to deconstruct hegemonic gender roles inside and outside audiovisual productions, and foster the reinvention of a new media imaginary where women's lives and dreams and desires aren't forced to be hidden away. This portion of women's cinema history proves then to be an exceptionally powerful theoretical and historical model for this other story centered around editing and remixing, which is women's history inside media fandom. To appreciate vidding positioning and functioning inside the contemporary media environment as a gendered practice, we can turn to scholars such as Laura Mulvey or Claire Johnston and all feminist film theorists that try to investigate that complex and eclectic field that is women's cinema. In particular, I would like here to propose a connection between Alison Butler's theory of women's cinema as a minor practice and women's film practices such as vidding. In Women's Cinema, the Contested Screen's introduction, Butler proposes this new definition in an attempt to go beyond the oppositional and often alienating role advocated for women's cinema in regard to mainstream cinema by previous feminist scholars. She defines women's cinema as a minor cinema, inspired by Deleuze and Guattari's definition of minor literature, which is, and I'm quoting her, that quotes them, a minor literature is the literature of a minority or marginalized group written not in a minority language, but in a majority one. So women's cinema thus would be the cinema of a minority or marginalized group made using not a minor, but a major language. Adopting this definition meant in Butler's intention to escape the marginalization of women's art expressions and I'm quoting her again, to free it from the binarisms, popular, elitist, avant-garde, mainstream, positive, negative, which result from imagining it as a parallel or oppositional cinema. End of quote. Several elements of minor literature fit well with women's cinema. Amongst them, Butler signals the displacement, dispossession, or deterritorialization, a sense of everything as political, and a tendency for everything to take a collective value. We can easily adapt this reasoning to the vidding practice as a gendered fan practice. We are facing a form of expression that is using the majority language, its grammar, its syntactic, its vocabulary, and incorporate, rework, and contest the conventions of established traditions. We need to keep in mind that vidders are first and foremost consumers and spectators of media products. They assimilate images, stories, and characters, formats, and styles of television and cinema. They talk about them extensively in their online and offline spaces. These elements become the vocabulary of a sort of communal language, a collective imagination within the community that is inevitably that of the majority. There is a canon for these stories and characters, and mainstream corporations are those that produce these images. It's the shared space provided by the communal language that allows its inhabitants to identify and appreciate the changes and variations created through their remixing acts. Moreover, thinking of Vidder's cultural productions as minor will place Vidding in a mediated and contestatory relationship with mainstream media as well, allowing readers to inhabit that the blurred boundaries that separate criticism and pleasure, without having to take a stand against or for one of the two. On the contrary, readers frequently claim the right to enjoy the images they love and at the same time partially criticize them as an act of empowerment against their supposedly passive attitude towards media images. As Christina Buse says, Vidding is a form of affective aesthetics. It means that it's a visual form, it must be understood and in its complexity, and we must see it as the intersection of affection and analysis and critique. Finally, considering Vidding a minor audiovisual practice allows us to stress its functioning as a collectivity. Butler says, because a minor literature emerges from a deterritorialized group, its function is to conjure up collectivity, even in the absence of an active community. Vidding has been indeed involved in the projection of a community for a group of deterritorialized women that were scattered around the world for more than 4 decades. Their communal passion for movies and TV shows and audiovisual editing, expressed through the practice of Vidding, is what brings this community of women together. The idea of a minor practice that adopts the majority's language finally echoes bell hooks' reasoning around margins once again. Quoting poet Adrienne Rich verses, "This is the language of the oppressor, but I need it to speak to you," Hooks reflects on how it is sometimes necessary to adopt the language and the spaces of the oppressors, of the majority, to be able to effectively impact and change the world, because, and she says, to be in the margin is to be part of the whole, but outside of the main body. The third knot of our string figure comes from those studies that appeared at the end of the 1980s, at the crossroads of audience studies and cultural studies, that later took the label of feminist audience studies. Rosalind Gill defines it as the turn to pleasure. After years of investigating the dangers of media misrepresentation of women, these studies were the sign of a completely different mindset, with an innovative anti-essentialist notion of gender and gender performances. They not only proposed a more compelling case for an audience that wasn't at all so passive as what was believed to be before, but most importantly, they focused on those neglected popular culture products for women, before deemed unworthy of our academic consideration. Georg Hermes defines them as, and I quote, "arguably the best possible expression of feminist engagement in media studies. His research bears witness to a spirit of solidarity and recognition of unequal gender relations." End of quote. Seminal studies such as Janice Radway's Reading the Romance or Yan Eng Watching Dallas and others allowed for the voices of ordinary women and sometimes ordinary men to be heard, and focused on these groups' meaning-making processes regarding the media they consumed. The subtitle of Tanya Modleski's Loving with a Vengeance, which deals with women as readers of mass-market romance novels, suggests that these are in fact mass-produced fantasies for women. There is then the need to focus on women's pleasures and desires and fantasies to understand gendered audience practices functioning. These kinds of works, mostly based on ethnographic methodologies, also insisted on a reorientation from media objects as text towards spectatorship as a social practice. A similar perspective is at the center of Nancy Bame's book, Tunin Logan, a crucial and pioneer work that explored female audiences in online communities. Bame's analysis not only overtook the simplistic equation of audiences as passive consumers, but managed to correlate critical conceptualizations of fan discourses as cultural production and online interactions as social practices. Bame investigated a Usenet community of fans of soap operas, excavating their interactions and their self-perception as a marginalized community, not only because most members identified as women, but also because of their interest in one of the most execrated media products of all. Soap operas are the ultimate gendered media, following hegemonic stereotypes that see it as a silly leisure pastime for uncultivated and passive spectators. The devaluation and shaming of female spectators are a well-known leitmotif for those who study audience culture, either for the kind of product consumed, if it doesn't adhere to intellectual standards, or the way this product is approached. The idea of gendered media pleasure is relevant to reconfigure our understanding of the profound bias against fangirls and their performances as fans. You can see something here coming from a fan vid that's titled "We Didn't Start the Fire." Literature is abundant regarding the shaming of fangirls and fangirls' practice. This is another stereotype that seems unbreakable. Since Henry Jenkins' pivotal study, Sexual Portraits, in 1994, fan studies scholars have tried for decades to address and dismantle stereotypical representations and understandings of fans' behaviors and practices. Jenkins connected them primarily to transgressive reading practices and tastes that contravene societal norms in the culturally sanctioned binary between good taste and bad taste. While these thoughts are undoubtedly true for any kind of fan activity, shaming and evaluations of what is acceptable or unacceptable are decisively gendered. Not only historically female-oriented cultural products have always been placed at the bottom of the hypothetical cultural acceptance scale, as any pejorative name from chick flick to rom-com can easily show, but there has been a tendency to discipline women far more than men for the same kind of out-of-the-norm behavior. Moreover, the scale of shaming, these emotional states in which female fans seem to be found in any given moment, always increases exponentially when they express any form of sexual desire, which is an underlying element of subversion and transgression in many female fandom practices. For all these reasons, women in fandom did exactly what other women in other media fields, or basically any other cultural field, did. They carved places for themselves, private and safer, where they could misbehave freely. As in many other cases, then women's isolation and wilfulness of staying far from the spotlight is due to a need for privacy and protection from public scrutiny. That is also why, along with legal repercussions, women fans tend to have nicknames to protect themselves and separate their fanish persona and their real one. So the last knot in our string figure is somehow connected to these spaces, specifically the online spaces that fans inhabit since the early 1990s. Many scholars have explored the connection between gender and the web, focusing for a long time on a utopistic liberation from earthly gender boundaries that the virtual world was supposed to provide. In fact, the web proved to be way less dreamy than those early prophecies framed it to be. One of the most pressing issues concerning the investigation of virtual spaces is in fact based on a misunderstanding. We still consider the internet and everything that revolves around it, text, images, connections, relations, ideas, as something that is virtual, is volatile, is disembodied, and ultimately separated from real life. On the contrary, online spaces and practices are part of our everyday life since at least 30 years. And as such are deeply embodied in our identities. Lisbeth van Zoenen affirms that there is a decisive moment in any technology's history, and that is when technologies are domesticated in everyday lives. In recent years, several feminist scholars have focused their attention on online feminist practices, with particular attention towards communities and groups that are using online spaces, primarily social media, as more or less structured political and subversive spaces, from the participation in international and national movements to hosting critiques towards media and their representation of women. And many have explored the potentialities of digital tools and spaces for the emergence of a diffuse counter-hegemonic discourse around feminist issues. Nevertheless, as Aristia Futopolo argues, online spaces innovative and political dimension does not reside exclusively with meanings and representations. Still, we need to focus more on the kind of encounters and social relations these media allow, reconfiguring the potentiality of action of those who inhabit them. This is extremely important when applied to fun practices and communities, because the risk of focusing only on those communities and derivative works that are explicitly political and resistant is always present, as was the case of the first phase of fun studies. Vids and Viders aren't relevant only when they focus on women's representation or lack thereof, as the Vids that I showed you initially. It is the communities themselves, and more importantly, the modalities of action of their members, how they manage their spaces, how they interact with each other, how they use their tools, material, and skills that are of relevance and apt to be studied within a specific feminist orientation. If we don't put the practice before the products, we won't overcome those hierarchies of value that plague the discipline and ultimately delegitimize those that do not fit the hegemonic standard also within the margins of the center. Even Vids that celebrate the romantic story between two characters are relevant because they are the result of the Vidder participation within a community of peers, a community of women that together have managed to carve a space for themselves and their media pleasures, actively suppressing the shaming and biases they have experienced elsewhere. Vidding, as all fun practices, is also a form of participatory culture, a topic that has been extensively explored following multiple trajectories. Many have focused on the economic framework that surrounds this kind of culture. Others have studied the complex legal entanglements of participatory culture. Others have focused on the particular kind of labor that this culture implies, that is consistently free labor, also defined as playbor, play plus labor. As problematized by Trevor Scholz and others, this is the kind of labor that users put to service for their platform, website, online group of choice. In Finnish spaces, we frequently hear the phrase labor of love to signal this particular kind of labor to create necessary to create fun works and manage fun spaces out of fans' passion for media or Finnish culture in general. Participatory cultures and labor have been studied using an assorted set of approaches, but surprisingly, or maybe not so much, rarely adopting a series of reflections concerning immaterial labor that feminist theories have developed since the 70s, as if immaterial labor was invented only when it moved from the kitchens to the internet, as noted by Kylie Jarrett. Similarly, Ursula House observes that academic debates about the blurring of the boundaries between work, consumption, and leisure have also generally been conducted without reference to feminist debates about reproductive and consumption work. In her Feminism, Labor and Digital Media, Jarrett tries to bridge this gap by exploring the connections between feminist theories on immaterial reproductive work and labor, starting from a correlation between, and I quote her, the socially significant aspects of housework and these depictions of users' activity. Jarrett investigates various typologies of immaterial labor online following the feminist Marxist framework of care work. She coins the figure of the digital housewife that mimics online the same characteristic of domestic care work. Like its domestic counterpart, digital care work is characterized by immaterial qualities, affect, love, care, socialization, organization, that makes it the kind of work that someone desires to partake in, or the kind of work that at least has desirable effects, both social and individual. Jarrett said, in all the studies of the cultures of digital media users, we find a range of digital housewives at work generating vital, inalienable commodities. She says that dismissing these inalienable outcomes of this labor, it means omitting an important aspect of this activity and to perpetuate the androcentric bias that acknowledges only certain kinds of activity as productive and or meaningful. In my opinion, this perspective is particularly productive to explore the inner mechanisms of a fan practice such as bidding, predominantly composed by women, and to understand the myriad of activities that bidders invest in to organize and manage and take care of community spaces. These activities, even if they are exploited in the economic circuits of the commercial web, also implicate a long series of desiring meaningful, effective activities that are ultimately at the very core of bidding as a labor of love. So, and I'm concluding. To tie again all these knots, I wanted to conclude with a final vid. And I picked Carry That Weight, a vid created in 2017 by Anual, a vid, and that's dedicated to the female protagonist of the Star Wars saga. That is also my favorite piece of popular culture. This is a sort of an emotional vid that celebrating once again beloved characters, made after the first wave of misogynistic hate that a huge part of male Star Wars fans directed towards the newest installations of the saga because of the increased presence of women and people of color in the movies, and the level of vitriol was really, really intense. The song chosen by the vidder is the infamous Beatles song, and this is a beloved song within the community, also associated with other vids, very influential vids. So therefore, the presence of this song alone calls for a connection with previous cherished moments within the community. It is immediately understood for a vid watcher that this is a metatextual vid, a vid that tells more between the lines. The weight in the song is always symbolically associated not only with the weight of, in this case, saving the galaxy for the characters, but also with the efforts of living in a world where you constantly have to create your own writing table and to stand up and walk to defend yours and your peers' space. So I leave the floor to Carry That Weight.
Once there was a way to get back homeward. Once there was a way to get back home. Sleep, pretty darling, do not cry, and I will sing a lullaby. God in slumbers, feel your eyes. Smiles awake you when you rise. Sleep, pretty darling, do not cry, and I will sing a lullaby. Once there was a way to get back homeward. Once there was a way to get back home. Sweet pretty darling, do not cry, and I will sing a lullaby. Once there was a way to get back homeward. Once there was a way to get back home.
So as you have seen, the end of this vid is also an homage to all the fangirls and the vidders that share that weight of joy and resistance, of pleasure and reappropriation of stories that ultimately defines us. And as a vidder said, vids are a form of communal poetry. And I hope to have provided you with some new knots to shape your next string figures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucia.
Okay, I'll stop sharing.
It was wonderful. I'm a little bit touched by this last vid. It was great.
I always cry when I watch it, so
yeah, it's really emotional. I don't know what this conversation will be like, but it's great. Thank you so much. I hope everybody loved it as well. So now I would like to open the conversation with the audience. Does anyone have a question for Lucia? Feel free to talk. So while people are still, okay, Katarina, were you going to? You have to turn the sound on.
Sure. Thank you, Lucia. This was a lot to take in. Yeah. I have to say I'm not very familiar with this topic. I tend to focus a lot on the product, and even artists usually don't interest me that much. I really focus on film usually. But I found your presentation very interesting. This historical perspective was very fascinating to me because since I never really thought about this much. I usually saw it as a more recent phenomenon. So it was very interesting to see these differences that you highlighted, and it was really funny because when we were off, we had a little exchange about soap operas, and little I know that you would mention that briefly, but I'm bringing this up because immediately we started with this emotional side and this memory that this brings to us, to see the soap operas with our grandmothers or with our mothers, and it's very interesting because you are right. Usually this kind of I don't say products. How do you say it? These objects, yeah. We tend to look at them as they are not, to diminish them, to think that they are not, they don't deserve our attention because they are only, they are too linked with the emotions, so they are outside our interests. And I think you showed that this is important, and you brought this community side to this discussion that was very interesting. So it was more of a comment. I don't know if someone wants to take on, or if you want to, yeah.
No, is it for me? I was just wondering is there anybody else who'd like to talk, or can I continue? Okay, so Lucia, once again, thank you for this. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about vidding during the analog era. How would the people organize themselves to produce these not subjects, but these vids, and how did they get in touch with each other as the cultural practice. How was it done?
Yes. So, I mean, I know only about the American side. I haven't encountered anybody doing this in other places in Italy or in Europe. I would love to. Probably they are there. Simply, I didn't stumble upon them. But they basically usually met at conventions. So in that moment, the 80s, conventions were 10 conventions, like Comic-Con is the most famous, but there were tons of them. They were the place to be, and they met each other there, and they bonded through their love for TV series, and usually one woman in the group had machines. The interesting thing is that at the time they were older than fans now, because these were women that some of them were working in IT or in technological fields, and so they knew how to use a computer, how to work the VCRs, and especially the editing devices. Some of them had a beta table to edit, but it was because of their profession. So it's even the ages are very different from our perception of fans today. So they met at conventions, they bonded together, and they started these little collectives. And usually it was based on the geographical area, because then they had to meet in person to create these vids. And the small clip that I showed you from that one vid, it was a typical meeting. So two women drove to the same house, two or more, in that case it's two, and they spent together a weekend watching, timing. It was very time consuming. You had to have at least 2 VCRs, virgin cassettes, tapes and tapes and tapes of material, and then you spent hours timing things with watch stops, stopwatch, and then you had to sync, and then you had to sync the video with the audio. So it was extremely taxing, and if you made one mistake, you had to redone everything. So in all the accounts, they say that the most beautiful thing of the digital world is that you can make errors. It's not, condemning your product. So that was basically what happened. And then they started to move online with the communications in the early 90s, when Usenet groups, mailing lists. So they started also to connect to people that lived far away from them. And then the rest is it's everything moved to the digital side. But because of this, the people that were the most active videos in the 80s then became the ones that started the vidding convention. So the conventions dedicated only to vidding. They opened the major websites or the major blogs about vidding. So they stayed as the fairy godmothers, in a way, of the community. So that way of understanding that you should do this stuff together stayed with them. And even if you look at YouTube communities nowadays, it's filled with what is called collabs. And it's women that probably haven't ever met each other in real life, young girls, collaborating with each other to create remixes. So it's a story that keeps on happening in a similar way.
Yeah, but the physical dimension, the material dimension has been lost for
Almost
now.
Completely. Conventions are still there. I mean, not now.
Yeah, of course.
But conventions are still there. There are many. Some conventions dedicated to vidding, only vidding, and some other are conventions dedicated either to sci-fi or a specific TV show or Star Wars, it depends, with the vidding section. But at the beginning, there was also the clear necessity to stay away from men that dominated the community and really didn't like this kind of activity. They were not welcoming of those things inside the first convention. There are many accounts of this sort of thing. So the gender division started in the 70s.
Immediately. Yeah, and so I have to ask this. Concerning legal issues, how has Viders been dealing with it?
So so it's a very complicated thing.
Yeah.
It's a very complicated thing, but let's start with the thing that vids are legal because they fall under the fair use doctrine, which is present in the American copyright legislation, in Commonwealth copyright legislations, in European copyright legislation. So they are in fact fair use, fair usage of material appropriated for they criticize the source or they celebrate the source, but it's everything is legal. But especially in the early days of the internet, legal things, legal issues were omnipresent. And it's in fact one of the main reasons why vidders stayed anonymous. They kept everything in the dark. And in the 2006, 7, 8, those years, that was the first moment of discovery, let's say, of vidding outside because of YouTube. So some vids were uploaded on YouTube and people started to find them, and then they started to appear in magazines or in the New York Times. So some places that put a lot of pressure in the community, and there were fights over the decision to be more visible, because the history of vidding was nowhere, or less visible but more protected.
Mm-hmm.
So that is still a major issue. Even nowadays, the point now is that it's much more common and accepted, and copyright holders simply accept that these things are there and they are profitable for them, so they are not stopping them anymore. But there is no new development in legislation. So if you want to take down something because it's a legal infringement of copyright, you can, and it's still happening. And there is no archive for this kind of thing, while it exists for textual fan practices, because of course words can stay everywhere, but clearly images are a very different story.
Okay, thanks, Lucia. Elena, do you have a question? I don't know, Lucia, if you remembered, Elena.
Hello.
Yes, of course.
Hi.
Well, I have a compliment first and then a speculative question. Well, I'm really fascinated how you link together all those strings who are like coming from very different places, like fandom, gender, found footage, digital and technological studies. I'm really fascinated how you put all of those in my head incoherent things together in a very smooth and beautiful way. So thank you for that. And then my question is, it's a little bit speculative. I mean, I'm still wondering about it. What is the difference between bidding and video essays that are nowadays everywhere, and academia, and very serious and very legitimate and recognized places are now asking for them and are providing a very, very recognized space. And my speculation is now recognized and legitimate because now it's in academia and now it's not that feminine anymore, it's more masculine, because maybe bidding was very feminine or much more done by women, and now video essays are much more serious, like with all the quotation marks that you want, and now men are very much involved in that way. So could you please tell me what you think about that?
So thank you.
Between bidding and video essays.
Thank you. So yeah, I thought a lot about that, and for me, the only difference is the community behind it. So for me, a vid and a video essay, the only difference is that a vid comes from all those things. It comes from the discussions, comes from a place of sharing, a place of also joy, and it's really a celebration. So it's maybe not the product. In some cases, I think some vids are even better. It's really, they are beautifully executed. The editing is superb. The level of the analysis in terms of visual analysis is majestic. It depends on the vid. But because they are made by fans, and sometimes, and we have also this perception that are made by young people, but in fact, people way over 40 are in fandom and are making this kind of thing. So it's not only young women. We tend to neglect them. But if you look at two things, a video essay and a fan vid, usually there is not so much. So it's really, I think it's just the case of the community, and also the stance regarding the material. So for vidders, even when you make a very angry vid because you really hated something, you hate a story arc, you hate how they ruin the character or whatever, or you hate a specific trope, gender violence, it depends. It comes from a place where you are angry because you love the source and you have discussed that anger with your peers. When with video essays, we assume that it's a very scientific, objective stance. Maybe usually you love the things that you talk about, or maybe you just enjoy them, you find them interesting, but it's not a question of passion, it's a question of objectivity. So yeah, I think it's gendered, and maybe it's even a question of status, academics versus fans. Plus some videos are academics themselves. That's another thing. So there are many.
So it's like cooking at home with your family is done by women mainly, and haute cuisine in a restaurant is done by men. Like,
yeah, it's that total thing. It's also very it's something that it's recurrent in the history of women within audiovisual practices. As long as a practice is deemed somehow not very relevant, not very artistic, as was editing at the beginning of the history of cinema, women could practice it, no problem whatsoever. The moment it becomes something that is of value and is celebrated, other genders appear. It's typical. It's a typical process, let's say. But thank you for the question and the compliments also.
Talita, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Lucia, for your presentation. I was listening and being amazed. So first of all, congratulations. And second of all, I'm not a fan culture studier, but I'm friends with one. So I'm very much familiar with all the debates and everything. So I really liked your approach on this combination of fandom and gender as something that results in content, in a production of content, because at the end of the day, all these fan videos are content made by fans about something they are emotional and affective related to, right, during the course of time. And what I'd like to ask you is, how do you think this relation, thinking about gender specific, about female production, and even racialized productions in this fan-made videos that are very artistic, very creative. Do you imagine, in your analysis, do you see any difference between what has been done in the past that you so very properly construct historically in your presentation, and what is today, thinking about, especially when you say you're looking at American culture, the questions like Me Too, women representative, Black Lives Matter, and all these kind of things. How do you see this difference, and how you relate that new wave, let's call like that, in this moment from what was done before? Because nowadays, I think, complementing maybe what Elena said, that video essays are more academic and seen as more serious than a fan-made video. It's also you have it's about different things. And nowadays, this how you feel about something effectively is not restricted to pop culture, but it's everywhere. So you can do a video essay about something you love, being rational about it. And as a fan-made video, you don't have to. You just have to put your feelings in that. So I like to think how you see that difference between what was made before and how that affects nowadays during the current state of events and everything. And again, thank you so much for your presentation. I took notes, some things you quoted. I know the authors, I talked with them, and I didn't know they had this research about feminist audience, and I really liked it, actually. So I don't know if you understand what I'm asking, but thank you so much.
Thank you a lot for the question. So looking at the history of FunVids, one thing that happened, I have studied a lot the span of time between the end of the 90s and the first decade of the 2000s. So when you wanted to make a vid such as The Greatest, the one with people of color, it would have been impossible. So even in the span of 5 years, 6 years, vids like that one would have been impossible because there were not enough characters of color specifically in sci-fi. So the first Space Girl, 2011, it needed sources from 40 years of television, and the second one, it was basically 5 years probably, or even less. So the evolution is tremendous in terms of representation, in terms of numbers of characters. What I see now is more, and this sort of celebrations, it's time to celebrate. It's been a long time. So for fans, being able to do that sort of thing, which has a strong personal attachment, and also since we are living in these years, so it's in a moment of political turmoil, of racism and sexism, etc., it's very important to have these imaginary to be, comforted by. So I see a lot of this celebratory vids. The other thing that I see is that fans are very, very picky, and they are very, very precise. So there are a lot of vids which are a bit difficult to get because you have to know the source. So it always depends on if you know the source or not. That are looking for, okay, we have 10 people of color, but are they token minorities? Are they subordinate to the white people in the show? We have a female Doctor Who, but is it enough? Are they treating her well? So all these sorts of things are in vids. So they have shifted the lens of analysis. And it's a very, very precise and in-depth sort of criticism that you can see in fandom spaces nowadays, even made by very young people, because there is a circulation of intersectionality and ideas that before were just very, very secluded in some spaces and now are circulating more and more. So I see also that fandom is used, we are asking more from the media we consume, and fans are asking more as well. And on the other hand, there is this strong need of comfort, especially after the pandemic started. So and even before, the number of signs in marches that quoted fandom, that quoted Spanish things. Princess Leia was everywhere in all the women's movement marches. Hamilton has been used as a crutch for getting along with a very racist wave of politics and everywhere in the world. So it's really the affective part, the affective aspects are more important, even more important now than before, because it's more visible, because it's also very communicative. It has a communicative power that it's unprecedented. So in an essay by Francesca Coppa, she says, everybody speaks the language of Star Trek. So when I make a vid with Star Trek, everybody will get what I want to say. So probably not everybody, but it's a very powerful tool to put out your ideas. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, it was amazing actually, because you put all those, you connected with a bunch of things that are really important actually, and how fans are each day they get more exigent. They demand more from the content they consume, and if it doesn't give you this, they will demand to the producers, or they will even produce something that says that it's lacking, and what it is lacking, that you have to give something in return to a fan base and to society and pop culture in general. Thank you so much, Lucia.
I have to say that fans always demanded a lot from the producers. In Star Trek fandom, they started to demand LGBT representation in the 80s, and it was not given to them until 2013, I think. So they always asked a lot, because of course, they had the rights to. But nowadays, the level of this demands, of course, it's not. It's unprecedented.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to ask Lucia something? Okay, Lucia, I have a request, but I don't know if you're able to show us. Do you think it's possible for us to see a couple of vids that you've mentioned in your presentation? But if not, it's okay.
I can try.
Because this is quite. It's an emotional subjects. These are emotional and important and engaging subjects. So it would be wonderful for us to see more of this. That the first time that I even heard about this, it was with you and Elena some years ago. I've never even touched.
Let me try to find what I have in the computer a lot.
It's problematic or hard? Don't worry.
So wait, I have those in the presentation. I can put the audio on. Let me try. All right, let's see if I can. So this is a vid that was one of the vids about gender-based violence. So it comes with a trigger warning. It's a sort of an ancient vid nowadays, because it was created within the supernatural fandom. Let's see if you can see it.
And the sky was made of amethyst, and all the stars are just like little fish. You should learn when to go. You should learn how to say no. My life's a day. Mine is forever. My life's a day. Mine is forever. When they get what they want, they never want it again. When they get what they want, but they never want it again. Go on, take everything I want you to. Go on, take everything I want you to. And the sky was all violet. One again, but violent, more violent. And I'm the one with no soul. One above and one below. My last a day. Mine is forever.
give you just a couple of things to get the context. The series is with monsters, and the women, they're either the victim or the monster. So, please let this ended.
It's amazing.
Okay, so to give you a context, I mean a bit of context for this one, this is from Supernatural. It's from 2007, so the series just ended. So it's been going on for forever, basically. So especially at the beginning in the first seasons, and this series had an almost all-female audience. The women present in the series were either the victim of the day. Each episode had a woman that died horrendously, or the monster, the vampire, the demonic presence, etc. All the women involved with the two protagonists died. Their mother, their fiancés, their girlfriends, everybody with a female body was dying horrendously, really cruelly. And when this vid was created within the fandom, it was a hit because I remember the discussions going on, and everybody was saying, I mean, how could I have watched this series for 3 years and never noticed that no woman is surviving this show? And the point is that in this case, you just put all the scenes with this horrendous level of gore, violence together, and it's visible, something that was there but invisible in the original context. I can show you a bit of like a lighter a lighter one, which is this one, I'm Your Man. A compilation of women in drag.
Could you put it bigger, like in presentation mode?
Sorry?
Could you put it bigger?
Oh,
Like
yeah. Let me
this?
try. Okay.
Yay.
If you want a lover, I'll do anything you ask me to. Or if you want another kind of love, I'll wear a mask for you. If you want a partner, take my hand. Or only want to strike me down in anger, here I stand. I'm your man. And if you want a boxer, I will step into the ring for you. Or if you want a doctor, I'll examine every inch of you. If you want a driver, climb inside. Or only want to take me for a ride, you know you can. I'm your man. Oh, the moon's too bright, the chain's too tight, the beast won't go to sleep. I've been running through these promises to you that I made and I could not keep. Oh, but a man never got a woman back, not by begging on his knees. Or I'd crawl to you, baby, and I'd fall at your feet, and I'd howl at your beauty like a dog in heat, and I'd claw at your heart and I'd tear at your sheet. I'd say, please, please. if you wanna sleep for a moment on the road, I will steer for you. Or if you wanna work the street alone, I'll disappear for you. If you want a father for your child, or only wanna walk with me a while across the sand, I'm your man. I'm your man.
So this was, as I said, for this International Day of Femslash, which is a fandom day of celebration of female pairings in romantic relationships. And to give some context and some, those inside jokes in a way, or those things that you see if you have seen a lot in fandom, there were those scenes with the glass that people, not being able to touch with a glass or a door or something between them. And then at one moment, a big clock broke. That is a reference to a very famous explanation of slash that Henry Jenkins provided in one of his books. So slash is the practice of pairing two characters of the same gender in a romantic relationship that is not canonical. Of course, nowadays we have many canonical LGBT plus characters, but back in the days it was not that common, of course. So Jenkins says, if you put two characters together in slash, is as if that glass that divides these two people break down and they are finally able to touch each other's hands. So each time you see a scene with a glass breaking in fan bits, that's a clear reference to that explanation.
Thank you, Lucia.
To end with a more lighter and uplifting thing besides gender-based violence. It's a bit somber.
Okay, so thank you so much. I think, does anybody else would like to pose a question? No? Okay, so we'll end in beauty. Thank you once again, Lucia. It was wonderful. It's really remarkable. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this invitation.
Thank you. Bye.